All right, everybody. Today we're going to be discussing Unit 10 of the Palestine syllabus. I'm John Harfouche, and I'm here with Brandon Absher from the Radical Philosophy Association. And today we're going to be talking with Raja Halwani about his article, The Palestinian Right of Return, along with Victor Tadros's article, Inheriting the Right of Return. And before we get into our discussion, Raja, let's just say a few words about who you are. You're a professor of philosophy at the School of the Art Institute of Chicago. You got a Bachelor of Arts from the best university in the world, the American University of Beirut.
Indeed.
Um, if you ask my dad, it's the best. It's the best university. Uh, you have a PhD from Syracuse. You're the editor of the Philosophy of Sex, which is now in its eighth edition, and you're the co-author with Thomas Capitan of a book called "The Israeli-Palestinian Conflict: Philosophical Essays on Self-Determination, Terrorism, and the One-State Solution." That was a 2008 book, correct? Right? Um, and then just a brief word here about our other author, Victor Tadros. Victor Tadros is a professor of criminal law and legal theory at Warwick. He researches moral, legal, and political philosophy. He's authored four books on the philosophy of war and criminal law. The most recent book from 2020 is called To Do, to Die, and to Reason Why. Um, and again, we have your article, Raja, The Palestinian Right of Return, which is from 2021, and Victor's article, Inheriting the Right of Return, which is from 2020. And as we'll see today, these two articles are in conversation. They're citing each other, critiquing each other, and building off of each other's um, ideas. So, welcome, Raja. Thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
Let's get right into it, Raja. Could you maybe say a little bit about what motivated you to write this article and sort of where you saw the discourse on the right of return, such that you thought this intervention had to be made? Where were you in your thinking and in your writing when you published this a couple of years ago?
Yeah, thanks. What motivated me to write this article were basically two kinds of motives. One is personal. I've always been interested in the Palestinian issue, the Palestinian cause. Basically, the woman who raised me, who was not my biological mother, was herself a Palestinian refugee. She nurtured me on a sense of justice and compassion, basically. But also more pertinent to this dialogue, and the other motivation is just I'm philosophically interested in the question. Basically, I am generally broadly interested in questions about territorial rights in general, group rights to have to reside in a certain territory, to a certain land. And obviously, there are fairly obvious connections to the question of the Palestinian refugees, because the Palestinian refugee right of return has directly to do with their ability to reside in what used to be historic Palestine and what is now Israel, basically. So these are my two main motivations for the question. And what prompted me to write this specific article in general was sort of a little bit selfish. I was very much unhappy with my view in the 2008 book that you mentioned in the introduction. I was specifically unhappy with the way I thought that the justification of the right was for the descendants of the original refugees. So it sort of bugged me for all these years, and I knew why it bugged me. I just thought it wasn't convincing enough, basically. And this is an issue we can get into in relation to Tadros's article too. And so that prompted me to sort of rethink the idea of what grounds the right of return for the Palestinian refugees. And so that resulted in this article that from 2021.
Okay, great. Um, and then maybe just to kind of set the stage here, one thing I can say about this article and as well the book that you wrote or the book that you co-authored with Thomas Capitan, um, it's very clear. It's very easy to read. I can't recommend that enough for anybody that wants to get into this discussion, certainly from the analytic perspective. The one thing that analytic philosophy never gets wrong is the writing and the argument is is clear, and so it's very readable. So one thing that you do for us here on page 68 of this article is you lay out the premises and conclusion of the, basically you give us the structure of the argument on page 68, and then the rest of the article you're fleshing that out and addressing counter arguments and supporting your premises. Could you maybe just walk us through the premises and conclusion that you've laid out there on page 68 and just kind of summarize the article for us? I mean, you do it so well in writing, but maybe we could just talk through it here for a second.
Yeah, sure. So I'll probably say something general about the argument just so that people who are listening to this will not get lost in the weeds. And then I can go over the premises if that's okay. So the basic idea of the argument is that the Palestinian right of return is not a basic right. It is a right that is derivative from a group right that the Palestinians have as a people, right? So, and this is one thing that I got wrong in my earlier writing. The way I was thinking about it was I was thinking of the Palestinian right of return as an individual right, but also as a basic right. So it's sort of bedrock, right? And I've come to change my mind about this. I see it more as a derivative right that comes out of a group right, namely the group being the Palestinian people in question. So once you have that in place, once you have the idea that that the Palestinians are a group in virtue of them being a people, right? Then the next question is, well, as a group of people, do they have any occupancy rights to Palestine? And by occupancy rights, I mean the right to be able to reside in historic Palestine, but not confined to a specific location. Think of occupancy right as the right to be able to. So, for instance, as American citizens, we have individual occupancy rights to live in the United States. That means not just the right to reside in my home or in my rental apartment or in my neighborhood, but also the right to move about freely along the country, to have any federal or state laws of the country apply to me, basically, without in a fair way as it applies to others. And basically the right not to be restricted in my ability to engage economically and politically and so forth with my fellow Americans, basically. And so that's basically the idea here. So the Palestinian people have this occupancy rights, and because they have this occupancy rights, then virtually every individual Palestinian also has that right, unless we're talking about specific cases in which somebody has forfeited the right for all sorts of reasons, which is not something specific to the Palestinians, but something that applies to any group of people, basically. And so in this respect, the right of return is a derivative right in virtue of the fact that every Palestinian has it. And so the nice thing I like about this argument, if I can be a little bit self-aggrandizing, is that the right of return doesn't attach to the notion of a refugee narrowly understood, by United Nations definition of what a refugee is. The right of return attaches to any displaced Palestinian, whether they are considered legally to be a refugee or not, basically, who lives outside historic Palestine or outside the green lines of Israel. So just to go over the premises, I'll do that somewhat fairly quickly, John, so that I will not, and then feel free to ask me specific questions about anything that I went by quickly. So the first premise basically says that in 1948, when Israel was established as a state, at that point in time, the Palestinians were a people that had occupancy rights in historic Palestine. And the idea here is that up to 1948, and for quite a period before then, Palestinians had resided in Palestine as a group, basically as a people, not just as individual villages or individual families, basically. They had a sense of their identity as a group, even though they had affiliations with the Syrians, even though they had affiliations with the Lebanese. But Palestinians as a people were also cognizant of themselves, of their identity as a group, due to all sorts of political factors. Some of them going back to Ottoman rule and the way the Ottomans have decided to divide their empire into different sanjaks, as they used to be called, different parts, basically. Um, and of course, their identity as a people was made stronger by the fact that the Balfour Declaration basically was issued in 1917, which basically gave promised the Jews a homeland in Palestine that sort of strengthened the solidarity of the people of thinking of Palestine as thinking of themselves as a people. So that's basically what the first premise says. The second premise says that nothing has happened to basically make the Palestinians cease to be a people. They continue to be a people despite their disbursement. Now, here there is a wrinkle because obviously there are some accounts that tie the notion of peoplehood to a specific territory, right? And some people can argue, well, the Palestinians can no longer be a people after 1948 because most of them have been dispersed throughout the lands, whether we're talking about the neighboring Arab countries or whether further out in the reaches of the world. But of course, the reason why the Palestinians are dispersed around the world is not because of some accident due to their, it's not due to some historical accident. The reason why this dispersed is because the very territory that they could have claimed their peoplehood on has been basically taken away from them by the state of Israel. So even though they are dispersed around the world, so I hope this point is clear. In other words, if you can, for example, imagine, I think John might have been frozen again. Are you still there, John? I think he's frozen. But I'll continue, and then he'll rejoin. So, so for example, you can imagine a group of people that have resided on a territory for a long time, but then say some sort of economic factors happened to them that, with advent of time, some of them went into, say, North Europe, into Sweden and the Scandinavian countries. Others went into say, South Italy, and with time they just became parts of other lands, even though some of them maintained some sort of group cohesion where they are. We would be hard pressed to call them a people at that point, precisely because they have no longer connection to the territory. And this is not the case with the Palestinians. So then we go to the third premise. And the third premise basically says that this occupancy rights that the Palestinians have has not been alienated or forfeited by the Palestinians. And to alienate a right is to basically waive it permanently. So, for example, if I waive my right to my bodily integrity by allowing my doctor to poke me, then I have for the next hour or so given the doctor to do that. But if I waive my right to my bodily integrity, so if I alienate my right to bodily integrity, then that means I waive it permanently. So that means I allow the doctor to poke me at whatever time they think is important for them to poke me, medically speaking. So the argument here is that the Palestinians have not alienated this right. There's nothing in the history there is nothing in their history that indicates that they have alienated the right. And nor have they forfeited this right. So one can forfeit a right, for example, by, say, letting it lie low, by not insisting on it. So, for example, to use an example from the philosopher Judith Jarvis Thomson, if I win a prize, and I have the right to that prize, but if I don't claim the prize after 2 or 3 years, maybe, then I have forfeited simply by just neglecting it, by not acting on it. If I own a cabin in the woods and I haven't used it or laid claim to it or did anything with my intentions to say that I will use it in the future, then one can say that with the passage of time, I've forfeited this cabin. But I don't think the Palestinians haven't done anything to forfeit this right, basically. And also, no other higher authority that can rightfully represent them has forfeited this right. Not even the Palestinian Authority has done this, in as much as we see this in the fact that every time the Palestinian Authority negotiates with the Israelis, although the negotiations have been dormant for the last few years, every time they negotiate with them, the right of return is always on the agenda. It's always relegated to permanent status agreements. So it's there. So that's the third premise. So one conclusion we can derive at this point is that the Palestinians continue to have the occupancy right, unless the right has been prescripted. And prescription is a technical term in political philosophy. It usually means one of two things. It means either that the right has been superseded or the right has been overridden. And so to say that a right has been superseded is basically to say that so much time has elapsed that we cannot simply go back and assert the right. So one example to think of here is the Arabs' inability to remain in Spain after Queen Isabella and Ferdinand reunited the Catholic kingdom. Sorry, John, I continued. Is that okay? Just so we
Yeah,
went.
so sorry, my internet just died. I reset the modem and I'm back.
All right, good. So I'm on the I'm on the fourth premise, basically saying that the occupancy right is still kicking, still alive and kicking. And I said that the only exception to this if it has been prescripted, and I was just saying that it can be prescripted if passage of time has rendered it obsolete. This is what's called in political philosophy supersession, right? So Muslims today can no longer claim the right to go back to Spain, just simply because so much time has elapsed since the reconquering of the Iberian Peninsula by the Catholics, basically, that they cannot. So we're talking here about what, 6 centuries, basically 8 centuries. Okay? Yeah, 6 centuries, 7 centuries. Sorry, my math is bad. And the other way for a right to be prescripted is to basically say something that certain facts on the ground have occurred that override that right. And in the article, I mentioned a few options of those. I'm not going to go over them all now, but probably the most prominent one is that in the land to where the Palestinians can claim occupancy rights is now a full-fledged state with its own national symbols, its own language, its own ways of life, its own culture. Although granted that culture owes much to Palestinian culture and to other Arab culture that the Sephardic Jews brought from them. But still, we have a thing called Israeli culture, Israeli nationalism. And so the idea here is that, look, well, you might have an occupancy right, but that occupancy right is overridden by Israel's sovereignty over what was historic Palestine. And so then the question becomes whether Israel's sovereignty over historic Palestine is strong enough to override that right. So then the question is, well, what does Israeli sovereignty mean, basically? It is typically understood as Jewish sovereignty. My apologies, my cat is meowing. I don't know if you know. So maybe we can keep him in the video. Typically that means Jewish sovereignty over the land, because this is how Israel understands itself as a Jewish state, basically. I'm going to put this aside for a second. So if we don't understand Israel as a Jewish state, right, then Israel's sovereignty over the land seems to be open because it can allow for non-Jews to be there. So there seems to be no reason at that point to have to override the occupancy right of the Palestinians. If Israel, however, is understood as a Jewish state, that gives it definitely a right to sovereignty, as we know, as insofar as Israelis are Jewish citizens of the land. But it doesn't seem to basically make the case that this sovereignty has to be exclusive to Israeli Jews. So somebody can make the argument, because Palestinians have an occupancy right, in order for that right to be overridden, the consideration has to be really, really strong. Since Jewish Israelis can maintain some sort of sovereignty over the land, even though it's not exclusive, then no case has been made that the occupancy right of the Palestinians is overridden. So the case for the occupancy right is strong. Given that the occupancy right is a group right that all the Palestinians have, it seems to follow that each individual Palestinian has that right. Now, somebody can quibble with this. They can say, well, look, the example that I use in the paper and the one that I borrow from Peter Jones from his essay in the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy, somebody can claim, well, look, the French people, for instance, have the right to participate in the Olympics. That it doesn't follow that every French person has the right to participate in the Olympics. Obviously, that would be absurd. And so why should we think that just because the Palestinians as a group have the right of occupancy, does it follow that every individual Palestinian has the right? And so my response to this is that it depends on the nature of the group right that we're talking about. Some group rights do not entail individual rights in that respect, but other group rights do. So for example, if you move away from the Olympics example and you think about, say, the right to cultural expression, which many philosophers are more than happy to attribute to groups, it seems that it is the kind of group right that does imply that every individual has the right to express themselves culturally. There wouldn't be such a group right if we didn't have those individual rights. And it seems that the right of occupancy is more similar to the right to cultural expression than it is to the right to participate in the Olympics. So it seems that the argument can conclude that the Palestinians, including individual Palestinians in general, have the right of return. And so one thing to note, I'm going to say two more things about this argument and then I'll stop. One thing to note is that it doesn't follow from this argument that every Palestinian has this right. If a Palestinian, for example, has forfeited the right individually, doesn't want to return, they just won't go back. Or if they have done something, say by way of aggression, for example, or if they've been convicted of something, they obviously will not have that right of occupancy. And the other thing I wanted to say is that this doesn't mean that no other individuals have rights to reside in historic Palestine. This argument establishes a sufficient condition for the occupancy rights. It doesn't establish a necessary condition. So other individuals might claim occupancy or residency rights in the land that who are not Palestinians or who are not Israeli Jews or Israeli Palestinians. Yeah.
Okay, thanks, Raja. That's a good summary of the piece. Brandon, did you have anything you wanted to ask in that coming out of that summary?
Yeah, so one of the thoughts that I had, and it comes up in your paper, so I thought it might be useful to go over a little bit, is the question of the sort of intergenerational character of the right, because as you point out in your paper, and this is seemingly an important part of the discussion within the literature, the occupancy right is much clearer in the case of people who were themselves physically displaced. However, let's say their grandchildren or great-grandchildren, perhaps that right has diminished. So if you could explain why it is that you would make the case that the great-grandchildren retain that occupancy right, even though they have never lived in historic Palestine.
Right. So I mean, this is precisely why I changed my view from my 2008 book and wrote this paper, because if you think of the right of return as somehow being an individual right or a familial right, basically, or a right that attaches not to the people in general, but to individual units, no matter how we decide what constitutes an individual, whether it's literally one person or say family units or village units or something like this, then someone can argue that the right weakens, so to speak, as the generations go by. So, for example, on my earlier view and on Victor Tadros's view, he grapples with these issues, for example, also. So, for instance, questions of, as he puts it in his article, somebody can establish the right of return by relying on the notion of struggle, as he says. So, for example, if you have a family that has inculcated in its children the importance of return to Palestine, so the parents die, but the children take up the struggle, right? Tadros seems to think that that the children have the right to return, because they somehow got it from the family and because they have the intention and the plans to continue to reside in Palestine. But one can see how this kind of right weakens with the passage of time, basically, and as one's children and grandchildren are not able to do that. Now, this might be the case with my argument, but if it is, it's going to require a lot more work to see why this is the case. And the reason why I say that is because I consider the right of return to derive from occupancy rights. So as long as the occupancy rights remain strong, and that depends on various factors, basically, as long as the occupancy right remains strong, and as long as we are willing to agree that the descendants of the Palestinian people are part of the people, basically, then there seems to be no barrier to claiming that those descendants also have the right, basically.
Okay, thanks. Let me go back to my questions here. Maybe we could talk a little bit about, you mentioned Victor Tadros's argument a little bit, but maybe we could look at that more thoroughly here. His argument for the right of return is grounded in a really particular idea of inheritance.
Yes.
Part of what he spends a lot of his argument going through different ways in which rights might be inherited, saying, these first two ways are wrong, and this is the way I think we should be discussing inheritance here. He thinks that typically this right of return discussion is too focused on the rights of the person inheriting the right of return, if I understand him right. And it's not that they don't matter, but what he really wants us to focus on, and you see this if you're following along in the reading, it really comes out on page 365. He really wants us to focus on the rights of the transferor, the originally displaced person who's transferring the right to their children. Yeah. What do you think about, like, we've talked a little bit about your criticism of his argument, but could you kind of say a little bit more about how you understand his argument and where you think it goes wrong, particularly this idea of inheritance? We talked about that question of struggle a little bit just a moment ago, but particularly this question of inheritance. Where do you stand with in light of what Victor Tadros has argued?
Yeah, so so he has this idea that there is a way of understanding the notion of inheritance, as you said, John, by focusing not on the transferee, but by focusing on the transferor. So, for example, sorry, not for example, that his basic argument basically is grounded in the idea that the person who has wronged, so the original refugees who were wronged, basically had plans and intentions to return to Palestine. I'm trying to locate the passage where he makes that crucial idea. So he says, the transfer center argument that I developed begins with the familiar idea that the wrongness of removing the original Palestinian refugees is grounded in the disruption to the significant and legitimately developed life plans that members of that group had to live a certain life within their community on their territory. So the focus here is on the transfer. So if I'm one of the original refugees, for example, then I have had a certain kind of life plan. And this life plan is not just isolated to me, it is connected to my children. So it includes that my children are part of this life plan. But more importantly, if I understand Tadros correctly, it is also connected to communally, to some potentially other Palestinians who had similar life plans. And it's connected to them in the sense that it's hard for me to have that kind of life plan without seeing myself as being part of that community also, right? And to see myself as part of that community, to want to raise my children in that way, also seems to have certain implications about where I see myself in the next few years, basically. So the idea is that as an original refugee, I have been wronged by having these plans, so to speak, aborted, disrupted, right? And so because my children are part of this life plan of mine, then they seem to inherit my right of return. So this is the version of inheritance that Tadros seems to accept when it comes to formulating the right of return in such a way that it is a right that is based on inheritance, basically. Now, it's an interesting argument. I think it suffers from a couple of things, I think. One is the notion of a life plan has to be articulated way more in order for us to see how it would work. The other thing that I have a slight issue with is the idea that what happens to those Palestinians who do not have life plans in the way that Tadros conceives of the notion of life plan. Now, the danger here is the following. The danger is conceiving of the notion of life plan so robustly on the one hand, that you can easily see how so many Palestinians would not have it, right? I take it that not every person has a sort of minutely detailed, robust life plan of how their life would go, right? Which should seem to exclude many Palestinians. Or you swing in the other direction where life plan just basically means, the idea that, I'm going to continue to live on this land in the far future, in the foreseeable future, in which case it's hard to see why we need the notion of life plans to be part of it, basically. So we really, so the danger here is that that kind of argument might exclude those Palestinians who didn't have these life plans. And then and I think he addresses it, but I can't remember exactly what he says. But he does say, in those cases in which the Palestinians' life plans were aborted because of a wrong done to them, and so they think that it is futile to be able to act on those life plans, basically. He says we still should honor those life plans because the reasons why they don't have the life plans is just because of their sense of futility that their life plans would ever come to fruition, basically. And of course, that response then raises the question, why even resort to the notion of life plan? Because you can actually use it to characterize almost all Palestinian refugees, those with and without life plans, basically. The third criticism I have that I worry about with Tadros's view is that insofar as those life plans are dependent on a certain kind of geography, communal life, landscape, and so on and so forth. And insofar as Israel has managed to transform, I mean, in some cases literally, but in other cases symbolically and expressively, insofar as Israel has managed to transform all these things, then it seems that those life plans cannot be executed anymore. And if they cannot be executed, then it would seem that the right of return would be undercut because of that. So, and I think it is the third criticism that is the most, is the strongest, I think, that Tadros's view has to face. And so, yeah, this is where I stand with the argument, basically. But I also want to say, I don't think that his argument is incompatible with my argument, because one can provide various justifications for the right of return, right? Some can be wider in scope or more inclusive in scope. Others are not, but they don't need, it's not a zero-sum game. In other words, somebody can say the right of return is justified by is grounded in various ways. One, in the group right that the Palestinians have as a people, but also somebody can say, well, some people have even a stronger right of return because of inheritance views like Tadros. So you can get into a situation in which some Palestinians might have a stronger right of return than others. I don't know. I'm not. I mean, it's possible, I think. And then such situations might actually help in cases in which somehow, say, we're implementing the right of return, but we're implementing it in stages. Then you have to have some sort of priority criteria. And then maybe the combination of certain arguments would give higher priority to some Palestinians than to others. I'm not sure, but that it's conceivable that it can go that way, basically.
One of the things that stands out to me in this conversation, Raja, is, this idea of a right of return is, some of these arguments are vulnerable to this kind of time decay, where the longer the occupation goes on, the less right Palestinians have to return. And so in effect, to win the argument, the occupation just needs to persist. And it gets to the point where a Zionist occupier could say, hey, look, it's been 6 centuries. The Muslims can't go back to Spain. The Palestinians can't come back to occupied Palestine. It seems to me that it's not fair to Tadros because Tadros isn't here, but it did seem to me like your argument was trying to kind of wall off that. That's a terrible metaphor, but sort of block that type of response to this idea of a right of return. Is that right?
Yeah, that's right. I think that's fair to say about my argument. Absolutely. Like you said, I'm not sure what Tadros might say about this, basically, but you're right. However, my argument can only do so much. But then I think the interesting thing about the argument is that, because it relies on the idea of the Palestinians as a people, as a group, as long as the Palestinians maintain their cohesion as a group, basically, that is going to, as you said, wall off that possibility as much as possible. Now, the argument is vulnerable in a different way, because it's not just simply the Palestinians being a people, it is also being able to maintain the occupancy right. So the vulnerability isn't so much in the notion of peoplehood. The vulnerability is going to come, well, for how many centuries down the road does a dispersed people have this kind of occupancy right? And obviously, there are going to be a lot of legal questions here. And, I don't think so. For example, the United Nations General Assembly resolution of 194 that basically allowed the Palestinian refugees to return to their homes didn't have a statute of limitations on it, basically, and I'm not sure how it can be debated in international legal courts. But I do have to admit, and I think this is a sad admission that I'm making, and I'm sure some people will disagree with me, I think history just has a way of changing moral facts, basically, simply because of the passage of time. So, and of course, there is something perverse about this, but we have seen, in the sense that all that an occupier has to do is just maintain an occupation, literally wall off, as in the, literally wall off people who are knocking on your door demanding their rights for just a long enough time, basically, in order to allow this passage of time to supersede whatever rights. So this is the argument from supersession. And in the paper, I say, 75 years, 72 years at the time of the paper isn't long enough. And I'm sure everybody would agree with it. But, when you start talking 200 years, 300 years, then we are on a whole different level. And unfortunately, this is a fact that has happened throughout history. So, imagine in ancient times, for example, when they say the Arabs conquered Persia, if they were the language of rights back then, the Persians can only demand a right to their culture or a right to freedom, to their own freedom of religion. After so many decades, that right will wither away, basically. So I think it's a phenomenon that is fairly common. It's unfortunate, but it's fairly common. History changes moral facts.
Can I ask a follow-up on this question? I mean, so you use when explicating this idea of supersession, use the idea of like a cabin that you have never returned to or a prize you didn't go to claim. Although, those things rely on the idea that you sort of, that the passage of time happens essentially through your own neglect, right? That is to say, you haven't expressed a will or carried out actions with intent to return. But it seems to me for the right to be superseded, maybe I'm wrong, this is not, literature that I'm very familiar with. It's one thing if you simply abandoned the cabin, but a different thing if somebody is standing there with a gun preventing you from having your vacation, right? And you show up every summer saying, oh, it's time, for the kids to hop in the lake or whatever, but somebody's there saying you can't do that. To then say that the right to that cabin was superseded does seem like a problem to me. I don't know if you would want to sort of flesh that out at all, or what your thoughts might be about it.
No, that's a great question, and obviously I agree with you. So there are at least two different ways that future history can go. For example, right, for the next couple of centuries, one alternative is that say Palestinians, they give up on the right of return. They don't vocalize it. They give up on the idea of having their own states just simply because most of them have been accommodated in other parts of the world. So say, for example, Arab states and other nations were to dismantle the refugee camps, were to give citizenship, to offer citizenship to the Palestinians, and the Palestinians were to accept that citizenship just because they're exhausted by centuries of this conflict. And so their insistence as a people on the right of return just is no longer there, basically. That would be one alternative possibility that happens in the future. And then you can see in this kind of alternative how supersession will take its toll, basically. But another alternative is we can imagine that the Palestinians refuse to give this up, basically, for centuries on. Basically, they maintain their cohesion as a people, and they insist all the time on the fact that they have a right to return, that their descendants do, and that they get assistance in this by certain other Arab countries. Ideally speaking, I mean, I think Arab states have been woefully inadequate when it comes to the Palestinian cause, but assuming at least they maintain a veneer of support by saying, we refuse to give citizenship to the Palestinians. We will ameliorate the economic situation as much as possible, but with them, we insist that they have a right to return to Palestine. Then obviously this changes, just because then what can be understood as happening is the conscious refusal of allowing the passage of time to supersede these claims. And I think when human beings put up this kind of conscious refusal to allow time to supersede, then time will not supersede it, basically. There's only so much you can do. I mean, it will be interesting to be able, if this course of history were to happen, it will be interesting to take a peek in 200 years and see what it's like, but from our vantage point here, it seems that the more cohesion and resistance the Palestinians have, the more they maintain it, the less we can confidently say that time has superseded those claims. Yeah. So that's a nice question, obviously. Yeah, I should have made that point clearer. I was just assuming that people are quiet about it for all this time, basically.
One thing, if I could just say, because this connects with another unit on the syllabus, Unit 13. in Unit 13, we're going to talk to Bashir Sadeh. And Bashir Sadeh wrote a book about the martyrology, or the philosophy of death, you might say, in this region. And one thing that he says in his book that's really interesting is he talks about how the there's certain projects going on in this region to sort of use the memory of those people that have been killed, the martyrs, the memory of the martyrs, to establish that they lived here, that they were here on this date when they were martyred, and they were martyred at this place. And the place is then often named after the martyr, as a way to, in a way, resist this occupation of land by using the martyr's time and place of death. And there's as the title of his book is The Politics of Remembrance.
Mhm.
And so it's a topic that we'll come to later in our discussions of this syllabus, but it's an interesting tie to some of your work, Raja, that I had never made before, honestly, until you just answered Brandon's question, but it's interesting.
No, absolutely. And I think I think the way to maintain those claims is not just simply by having conferences and through political leaders. I think it's also through projects like this. I think that's quite crucial. And the other thing to remember is that we live in a time in which we are abetted by technology and by all sorts of ways of being able to maintain records and we have video records, like we have like this one, for example. We are able to publish manuscripts on a very big scale. Muslims in Spain didn't have that kind of capacity, basically. So as with time, our technology allows us to keep things alive and going, so to speak. Yes, absolutely. So those things have to be kept in mind when we talk about supersession. Yeah.
Actually, just to that point, I mean, insofar as this is a resource for students, I can't recommend enough this piece here by Mahmoud Darwish, an important Palestinian poet. But this is Israel's War Against Palestinian Culture. And Raja, one thing that he says in this essay is that some of these invasions of Lebanon in the 1980s were primarily to destroy Palestinian cultural archives that had been established in Lebanon. And so there is in this conversation, I think your article does a really nice job highlighting why why these types of events happen and why they're important. There is a political battle over, and a military battle over memory and history and archives, in order to kind of, you might say, challenge this idea that this occupation has only been here for 70 years, that it was a colonial occupation, that it was in violation of international law, and so on and so forth. Things that Palestinian scholars have archived, along with maps, certain evidences that Palestinians ever lived here. Of course, the famous quote is, "A land without people for a people without land." Of course, that has to be in a way manufactured, and it's manufactured in part militarily, but also through the destruction of Palestinian philosophical tradition, for example, which is part of what we're trying to rectify through this project.
Yeah, I mean, Israel has destroyed the villages of the Palestinians. They've erased them. They changed the names. It was as if there was no people before that. So it was a retroactive changing the facts to fit the slogan, basically. The destruction of the educational institutions to make sure that there is no transmission of knowledge in the Palestinian population. And the point from Mahmoud Darwish, I mean, he was right. I was in Beirut in 1982 when the Israelis invaded. And one of the first things they did when they entered the city, they went to the offices of the Institute for Palestine Studies, مؤسسة الدراسات الفلسطينية, which is in a neighborhood in Beirut called Corniche al Mazraa. I don't know how much. I see the Lebanese flag on your T-shirt, John. I don't know how much that how well you know Beirut, but that's one of the first thing they did, and they ransacked the office basically. And one can make a strong case that there is a sort of erasure here of. I mean, and one point to keep in mind is that the ability of a people to make demands depends to a large extent on their ability to access these resources. I think this is a very important point to make. So when you get rid of these resources, you undermine the credibility of certain people to make certain claims because they are unable to back it up, basically, just to put it crudely. So yeah, that's why these things are important.
Yeah, yeah, I think that's a really such an important idea that's operating, I think, in the background of your article. And it was rereading this work for this interview. It was one thing that really stood out to me that I found really important. Maybe we have time for one more question. Brandon, do you have any questions? I have a few questions, but I'd open it up, Brandon, if you wanted to.
Well, I had one thought, but I'm certainly if we're out of time, I think I would turn it over. I would defer to you, John, if we're out of time. So I think I'll go ahead and defer.
Well, I had a few questions prepared. Raja, one question I could ask. Maybe I have two. I'll give you two, Raja, and you can choose which one you prefer to talk about. Okay. Mm-hmm. One thing I found interesting in the article was both you and Tadros agree that this idea of a right of return is incompatible with a two-state solution. You both seem to see the right of return in a one-state solution, which in the context as we present this is maybe for us here not such a radical idea, but has been construed in the broader public as a really radical idea. There's a necessary connection, it seems, between the right of return and a one-state solution. And I was wondering if we could maybe talk about that. The other question I had was just about how so many authors have relied on Zionist sources to question the legitimacy of the occupation. And that was something that I found conspicuously missing from both of these articles, which I don't think necessarily it's not a criticism. I just found it really interesting. For instance, a book like Shira Robinson's Citizen Strangers will almost exclusively work through Zionist history. Fayez Sayegh, who we'll discuss in units 4 and unit 5, is always advocating for other Arab and Palestinian authors to read and study Zionist sources and use Zionist literature against itself, a kind of imminent critique. And so really that's two different questions. And really, if you wanted to speak to either one, I find both of those really interesting.
Before you do, Raja, can I jump onto the first one? If you decide to answer the first one, because my actual question was sort of related. And so I just wonder about rights of occupancy and rights of citizenship and how the two relate, particularly as it pertains to this one state solution idea. So if you did jump on the first question, if you could address that too, that'd be interesting to me.
I was going to jump on the first question, not the second question. I will say about the second question that, of course, I've read a lot of the Zionist sources. Basically, one thing to consider is that in this paper, I was very limited in terms of word. I mean, you have practical limitations like word limits and all of this, but I am familiar with a lot of the earlier Zionist sources about their intention to remove the Palestinians from the land and ideas of transfer and all of this. And we have some good Palestinian sources on this too. Nur Masalha is one person to read. So I'll just put that for the record. But in any long-term project such as this, I will have to take these sources into account. So back to the one-state solution and the two-state solution and the right of return. I don't see a necessary connection between the right of return and the one-state solution, and I'll tell you why in a second. What I do see is that obviously if one accepts the right of return of the Palestinian refugees, one has an additional reason to accept the one-state solution. Because at that point, I mean, and of course, making certain assumptions, assuming that most Palestinian refugees agree to act on the right, so the right is implemented, and they agree to act on the right in a way that they do want to return to Israel, to Palestine, basically. Then somebody might as well say, well, we might as well just throw the towel in at this point, because obviously the numbers are going to be so high that demographically speaking, which is of course a major headache for the state of Israel, because they're always worried about demographics in terms of Jews versus Arabs or versus Palestinians. And I have to say, I want to register something. I am always unhappy with the Jew versus Arab kind of talk. I think it's ridiculous. I think one can easily make the case that almost all Palestinians today are descendants of the land of Canaan and the land of Judaism. And so there's probably a way lot more intermixing between the two people than Zionism likes to make. But it's thanks to Zionism that we have this distinction. But anyway, assuming that we do have this distinction, so somebody at that point will just basically throw in the towel, will say things, look, if we accept the right of return, from all the right motives, then we might as well just have one state for both people, just because of the numbers and because of the cultural intermixing that's going to happen and all this. So that gives us a reason to accept the one state. I don't think it's conceptually tied to it, however, for the following reason. And the reason is which is the following reason, which is that the question of one state versus two states has to do with the question of sovereignty over the land. So if we accept two states, we are basically saying, one state, you have the Israeli government that is sovereign. It is the Israeli state. In the other state, we have the Palestinian Authority or the Palestinian government that is sovereign in that state. The two states themselves don't speak about the makeup of the citizenry of those two states. So, for instance, we can all agree that France, for instance, it is the French government, the French presidency that is sovereign over the territory of France. But that doesn't tell us about the cultural makeup of the French people. So the French people are made up of Muslims, of Christians, of brown people, of white people, and so on and so forth. And so in principle, you can have Israeli sovereignty, you can have Palestinian sovereignty, but in such a way that under the Palestinian state, so suppose, for example, we have a Palestinian state in the West Bank and the Gaza Strip, right? Then, if none of the Jewish settlers in the West Bank move back to Israel, then you're going to have a situation in which you have a Palestinian sovereignty over a large segment of its population who are Jewish settlers, right? And then in Israel, you're going to have a situation in which you have Israeli sovereignty, most of it Jewish Israeli sovereignty, but part of it is also Arab, just given the makeup of the current state of Israel, that also oversees a large population at that point, with the right of return implemented, a large population of Palestinian Israeli citizens. So this is why there's no conceptual connection between the two. The two-state solution is compatible with the right of return because the state solutions have to do with who has sovereignty and who rules the land, basically, what kind of state you're erecting, whereas the right of return has to do with residency and occupancy rights. It doesn't say anything about sovereignty in and of itself, basically. Obviously, if the Palestinian refugees go back to Israel and they're not allowed any political participation, then we have other rights violations going on, the rights to political participation that people have, and so on and so forth. But these are rights different from the right of return as such, basically. Yeah. So I hope that clarifies.
Yeah, no, that's very helpful. Well, Raja,
John,
thank you so much.
Thank you, and
Yeah.
both of you for this interview.
Yeah, it's a real pleasure to read your work and get to talk to you about it.
Thank you so much. All right.
All right. Thank you.
Thank you.